For nearly 20 years, she lit the same candle every evening and placed it in the front window before darkness settled over the valley. The neighbors stopped asking why. The town stopped wondering. Then, on the coldest night of winter, someone knocked on her door. Margaret Hale lived alone in a weathered farmhouse at the edge of a small rural town. Since the disappearance of her husband Daniel nearly 2 decades earlier, she had followed the same ritual every night, lighting a candle and placing it in the front window facing the old road. Most people believed she was holding on to a hope that should have faded long ago. Margaret never argued with them. Some promises, she believed, were meant to outlive reason. The snow had been falling since late afternoon. Not hard. Just enough to soften the edges of everything. The fence posts looked smaller. The road looked farther away. Even the trees beyond the field seemed to be retreating into the gray winter sky. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the last traces of daylight disappear behind the hills. The house was quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that settles into old places after too many years have passed. The kind that listens back. I reached for the matchbox resting beside the sink. It was the same wooden box I had used for years. The same candle too. Not the exact candle, of course. But always the same shape. The same size. The same place in the window. Some habits become prayers after enough time. I struck the match. For a moment, the tiny flame hissed against the darkness. Then the candle caught. A warm golden light bloomed against the glass. Outside. Snowflakes drifted through its glow. I placed the candle carefully on the sill and stepped back. There. Just as I had done every evening for nearly 20 years. The townspeople used to ask about it. At first, they were gentle. They thought grief had simply made me stubborn. Then they became practical. Then concerned. Eventually, they stopped asking altogether. People get tired of waiting for miracles. Especially when they belong to someone else. But I never stopped. Not because I expected anything. At least that's what I told myself. I pulled the curtains halfway closed and turned toward the rest of the house. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. They always did. Every room carried its own voice. The hallway sighed. The kitchen clicked when it got cold. The stairs groaned if you stepped too close to the wall. After so many years alone, I knew every sound. Every complaint. Every memory. The farmhouse was old long before Daniel and I bought it. But he loved it immediately. I could still hear his voice sometimes. Not truly hear it. Just remember it so clearly that it felt real. This place has good bones, he had said on the day we moved in. Standing right there in the doorway. Snowflakes melting in his hair. Smiling like he already belonged. I swallowed and looked away. Certain memories still arrived too sharply. Like touching something hot before realizing it. The coat remained on the hallway hook. Dark brown wool. Worn around the cuffs. Daniel's favorite. I passed it every day. Every single day. People thought keeping it there was unhealthy. Maybe they were right. But removing it felt worse. As if taking it down would become an official declaration. A final sentence. Gone. Never coming back. I wasn't ready for that. Perhaps I never would be. Outside. The wind pushed against the side of the house. The windows rattled softly. I moved into the kitchen and prepared a simple supper. Soup. Bread. Tea. The same meal I had eaten countless winter evenings before. The kettle began to whistle. Steam fogged the window above the sink. Everything felt familiar. Predictable. Safe. And yet winter always carried a certain loneliness. Especially after dark. The kind that settled beside you at the table. The kind that occupied empty chairs. I glanced toward Daniel's place without thinking. The chair remained tucked beneath the table exactly where it had been left years ago. No one sat there. No one ever would. Still, I couldn't bring myself to move it. Some absences become part of the furniture. After supper, I washed the dishes and stacked them carefully in the cupboard. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Its rhythm filled the kitchen. Tick. 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 Time moving forward. Whether we wanted it to or not. By 9 o'clock. The snow had grown heavier. The world outside disappeared beneath white darkness. The road vanished completely. No headlights. No movement. No sign of life. I settled into the chair beside the wood stove. The fire crackled quietly. Orange light danced across the walls. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and opened the book resting on the side table. I read the same paragraph 3 times. None of it stayed with me. My attention kept drifting elsewhere. Toward old thoughts. Toward old questions. Toward a winter night nearly 20 years earlier. The night Daniel disappeared. No argument. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. One moment part of my life. The next. A mystery. Search parties had combed the woods. Neighbors volunteered for weeks. The sheriff followed every lead. Nothing. Not a trace. Not a clue. Nothing except silence. A silence that somehow lasted 2 decades. The fire shifted. A log collapsed inward. Sparks floated briefly up the chimney. I looked toward the window. The candle still burned. Steady. Patient. Waiting. Like it always did. The house seemed even quieter now. Almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you notice things. The wind outside had changed direction. Branches scraped softly against the roof. Somewhere in the distance. A dog barked. Then stopped. I glanced at the clock. 11:48. Nearly midnight. Another day ending. Another candle nearly burned through. I stood and stretched my stiff back. The floor creaked beneath me. The old farmhouse settling against the cold. Everything felt exactly as it always did. Exactly as it had yesterday. Exactly as it would tomorrow. Or so I believed. Then it happened. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. Not loud. Just firm enough. Knock. 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 The sound echoed through the house. I froze. For a moment. I thought perhaps I had imagined it. The wind sometimes played tricks. Old houses made strange noises. I listened carefully. Nothing. Only silence. The fire crackling. The clock ticking. My own heartbeat. Then again. 3 more knocks. Slower this time. Closer somehow. Knock. 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 Every hair on my arms stood up. No one visited this late. No one traveled these roads during a storm like this. Certainly not near midnight. I turned toward the front door. The hallway seemed longer than usual. Darker. The candlelight flickered against the walls. For several seconds, I didn't move. I simply stared. Listening. Waiting. Wondering. Who could possibly be standing outside in weather like this? The answer waited on the other side of that door. And somehow, before I even reached the handle, I felt the first crack appear in a routine that had remained untouched for 20 years. The knocking came a 3rd time before I finally reached the door. Not louder. Not impatient. Just steady. as though whoever stood outside knew I was there. Waiting. Listening. The porch light cast a pale circle onto the snow beyond the window beside the door. For a moment, I stood with my hand resting on the lock. The cold seemed to seep through the wood itself. The entire house felt as though it had stopped breathing. Then I turned the latch. The hinges groaned softly. A gust of winter air pushed inside. Sharp. Clean. Bitter. And there he was. A man stood beneath the porch light. Snow covered his shoulders and clung to the brim of his worn hat. His coat was old and heavy with moisture. The kind of coat that had seen many winters. Many roads. His face looked tired. Not simply from the cold. Tired in a deeper way. The sort of exhaustion that settles into a person after years of carrying things they cannot put down. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Snow drifted between us. The wind whispered across the empty fields. Then he lowered his eyes slightly. "Ma'am," he said quietly. His voice was rough. Weathered. "I hate to trouble you." The sound of it stopped me. Only for a moment. A strange feeling moved through me. Like hearing a melody from childhood but being unable to remember where it belonged. Something about his voice felt familiar. Not recognizable. Just familiar. A feeling without a memory attached. "I got caught in the storm," he continued. "The road disappeared about 5 miles back." He glanced over his shoulder toward the darkness. "I was hoping maybe I could wait here until morning." His words were simple. No elaborate story. No excuses. Just the truth as he chose to tell it. I studied him carefully. Living alone teaches you caution. Especially in isolated places. Yet something about him seemed unusually calm. Not threatening. Not desperate. Just tired. Very tired. The wind pushed another wave of snow across the porch. His coat shook slightly. I stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Relief flickered across his face. Small and brief. "Thank you." He removed his hat as he entered. Snow fell onto the floorboards. Tiny white pieces melting almost immediately. The warmth of the house wrapped around him. For a second, he simply stood there. Looking around. Not like a visitor. Not exactly. More like someone arriving somewhere they hadn't seen in a very long time. I couldn't explain why that thought entered my mind. But it did. His eyes moved slowly across the hallway. The staircase. The old wooden table beside the wall. Then they settled on the coat hanging from the hook. Daniel's coat. He stared at it. Only briefly. But I noticed. Something passed through his expression. Recognition. Maybe. Or memory. Then it vanished. "Long drive?" I asked. He nodded. "Long enough." His answer carried no details. Only distance. I offered him a towel and pointed toward the stove. He thanked me again and sat carefully in the chair nearest the fire. The flames reflected softly in his eyes. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. The way silence sometimes feels between strangers who have both lived long enough to understand it. Outside, the storm continued building. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Branches scratched against the roof. The old house settled around us. Finally, I moved toward the kitchen. "You eaten?" He hesitated. "Not today." I nodded. "Then let's fix that." The soup from earlier was still warm enough to reheat. I placed another pot on the stove. The stranger watched quietly. His hands rested together in his lap. Large hands. Rough hands. A laborer's hands. Hands marked by years of work. The kind Daniel once had. I immediately pushed the thought away. Too many years alone can make a person see connections where none exist. The soup simmered. Bread warmed in the oven. Soon the kitchen filled with familiar smells. Vegetables. Herbs. Fresh tea. Simple things. Comforting things. The stranger sat at the table while I prepared the meal. The fire crackled behind us. The clock continued its steady ticking. When I finally placed the bowl before him, he stared at it for a moment, as if appreciating something more than the food itself. Then he smiled. A small smile. Grateful. Thank you. You're welcome. He ate slowly. Respectfully. Not like a starving man. More like someone savoring a forgotten memory. Several times I caught him looking around the room, studying details. The old cabinets. The curtains. The worn edges of the table. Again. There was something unusual about it. Most guests glance around. This felt different. As though he was comparing the room to something inside his mind. Trying to confirm a memory. Trying to place a dream. Eventually his gaze drifted toward the living room. Toward the mantel. Toward the photographs. My stomach tightened slightly. The photographs had remained there for years. Family gatherings. Birthdays. Holidays. Daniel smiling beneath summer sunlight. Daniel standing beside the tractor. Daniel holding a fish near the river. Moments frozen in glass. The stranger leaned back slightly. His eyes remained fixed on them. Longer than necessary. Long enough for me to notice. Long enough to make me uneasy. You know someone in those pictures? I asked. He looked at me. Then back toward the mantel. No. The answer came too quickly. Not a lie exactly. But not entirely honest either. I felt it immediately. He stood slowly and walked closer. The firelight flickered across the photographs. His expression softened. Especially when his gaze settled on a picture of Daniel taken many years ago. Young. Laughing. Standing beside the barn. The stranger stared at that photograph longer than any other. His face became difficult to read. Almost sad. Almost lost. I watched him carefully. Something familiar? I asked. For a moment, I thought he might answer. Really answer. Instead, he shook his head. Just reminds me of someone. The room grew quiet again. The stranger kept looking at the photograph. Not speaking. Not moving. Only staring. The way people stare at things they're afraid to remember. A cold feeling moved through me. Not fear. Something stranger. A sense that an invisible thread had entered the room. A thread connecting this man to something I couldn't yet see. Something buried beneath years of silence. Finally he returned to the table. Finished his tea. Thanked me once more. Yet even then, I noticed his eyes drifting back toward the mantel. Back toward Daniel. Back toward memories that shouldn't belong to him. Outside, the storm howled across the fields. Inside, the fire burned low. The house felt different now. No longer empty. No longer familiar. As midnight slipped into morning, one question refused to leave me. Why did a complete stranger seem to know this house better than he should? The storm had passed some time before dawn. When I opened my eyes, the house felt different. Still quiet. But not empty. For nearly 20 years, every morning had belonged entirely to me. The same creaking floorboards. The same kettle. The same silence waiting in every room. Now there was another presence beneath the roof. A stranger sleeping in the guest room. And somehow that simple fact unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Pale sunlight slipped through the kitchen curtains. The snow outside reflected the morning light so brightly it made the entire room glow. Everything looked clean. Still. Almost untouched. I stood at the sink filling the kettle. The water hissed softly against the metal. Outside. A crow landed on the fence post near the road. Its dark shape seemed oddly sharp against the endless white field. The house remained quiet. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow. Measured. The stranger appeared a few moments later. His hair was still damp from washing. The lines on his face seemed deeper in daylight. He looked older than I first thought. Not frail. Just worn. As if life had spent many years asking difficult things of him. "Morning," I said. He offered a small nod. "Morning." His voice carried that same strange familiarity. Not enough to identify. Just enough to disturb something sleeping inside my memory. I poured coffee into 2 mugs. He wrapped his hands around one immediately. Holding it as though he needed the warmth. Or perhaps simply needed something to hold. For several minutes we sat in silence. The kind of silence older people understand. The kind that doesn't need filling. The clock ticked softly above the stove. The sunlight crept slowly across the table. Outside, the snow-covered fields stretched toward the horizon. Beautiful. Lonely. The stranger seemed lost in thought. Far away despite sitting only a few feet from me. Eventually he thanked me again for letting him stay. I told him there was no rush to leave until the roads cleared. He smiled politely. But something about his eyes remained distracted. Preoccupied. As though he were carrying a question he wasn't sure how to ask. After breakfast, I began washing the dishes. A routine I had performed thousands of times. The warm water soothed my hands. The familiar motions calmed my thoughts. At least for a little while. The stranger wandered into the living room. I could see him from the kitchen sink. At first he simply stood near the fireplace. Studying the room. Then his attention drifted toward the mantel. Toward the photographs. Again. The same photographs he had stared at the night before. Only this time something felt different. More focused. More personal. I dried a plate. Slowly and watched him. He picked up one frame carefully. Not all of them. Just one. My breath caught. It was Daniel's photograph. The one taken a few months before he disappeared. Summer sunlight. Blue shirt. That crooked smile he always wore when he was trying not to laugh. The stranger stared at it. And then it happened. A change. Small. Brief. But impossible to miss. His expression shifted. The way someone's face changes when they unexpectedly recognize a voice in a crowd. Or hear a forgotten song. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition. Pain. Confusion. I couldn't tell which. Perhaps all three. For several seconds he simply stood there. Looking at Daniel. Not studying the photograph. Looking at him. As though searching for something. Remembering something. The room suddenly felt colder. I set the dish towel aside. "What is it?" The stranger looked up. Almost startled. Then he quickly placed the photograph back where he found it. "Nothing." The answer came too quickly. Too smoothly. I had heard enough half-truths in my life to recognize one. I dried my hands carefully. "That's my husband." He nodded. I figured. His voice had become quieter. More cautious. I stepped into the living room. The fire crackled softly inside the stove. The only sound in the room. Did you know him? For a moment, I thought he might say yes. The pause lasted long enough. Instead, he shook his head. No. Again. Not exactly a lie. But not the whole truth either. I could feel it. The stranger looked away. Toward the window. Toward the fields beyond. Anywhere except at me. Then why were you looking at him like that? His jaw tightened slightly. Not from anger. From uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that comes before a difficult decision. Finally he exhaled. Slowly. Sometimes people remind you of someone else. I waited. The rest never came. The silence stretched between us. Long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he surprised me. Instead of answering my question, he asked one of his own. What year did he disappear? I blinked. The question felt oddly direct. Unexpected. 1987. He lowered his eyes. As if confirming something privately. And they never found him? The words landed heavily in the room. No one asked those questions anymore. Not after so many years. The town had moved on. Most people avoided the subject altogether. Yet here was a stranger asking about it as though it mattered. As though the details were important. I folded my arms. No. His gaze remained fixed on the floor. What happened exactly? Something tightened in my chest. I hadn't told the full story in years. Not because I couldn't. Because I was tired. Tired of repeating it. Tired of watching people search my face for emotions I no longer had the energy to display. Yet somehow I answered. He left for town that morning. The stranger listened carefully. More carefully than anyone ever had. He never came back. The room felt very still. I continued. The truck was found 2 days later near Miller's Creek. His eyes lifted immediately. A reaction so quick it startled me. I noticed. He noticed that I noticed. And suddenly the atmosphere changed. Only slightly. But enough. A hidden tension entered the room. Near the creek? He asked. His voice had become almost cautious. Yes. He nodded slowly. Almost as though he already knew that detail. A chill moved through me. The kind that has nothing to do with weather. I studied him carefully. The stranger looked uncomfortable now. Not because of my questions. Because of his own. As though each answer created a problem he hadn't expected. He walked toward the window. The snow outside reflected bright morning light. For several moments he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. Did they ever have a reason? For what? For him leaving. The question hurt more than it should have. Even after all these years. I looked down at my hands. No. The answer came softly. No reason. The stranger nodded. Almost sadly. Then the room fell silent again. Neither of us knew what to say next. Or perhaps we knew exactly what we wanted to ask and were afraid of the answers. The clock continued ticking. The fire settled lower. Outside, sunlight sparkled across untouched snow. Everything looked peaceful. Yet nothing felt peaceful anymore. The stranger remained standing by the window. Lost in thought. And for the first time since opening the door the night before, I felt certain of one thing. This man knew something. Maybe not everything. Maybe not even enough. But something connected him to Daniel. Something hidden beneath years of silence. Something buried somewhere in the missing years. And as I watched him stare across the frozen fields, I couldn't stop wondering what that connection might be. Or why he seemed so afraid to name it. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Neither of us said much after our conversation by the window. The questions lingered between us like smoke. Invisible. Persistent. Every time I looked toward the stranger, I found him staring somewhere far away. Not at the house. Not at the fields. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere only he could see. By noon, the clouds had begun to thin. Sunlight spilled across the snow-covered pasture behind the farmhouse. The storm had left everything untouched. Smooth. Silent. Almost unreal. I stood at the kitchen sink watching the light move across the fields. Behind me, I heard the stranger shift in his chair. Then his voice broke the silence. "My name is Samuel." I turned slowly. For a moment, I realized something strange. He had spent the entire night under my roof. Shared my supper. Shared my breakfast. And yet I had never learned his name. Samuel offered a small smile. The kind people wear when introducing themselves feels overdue. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have told you sooner." I nodded. "It's all right." But it wasn't really all right. Not anymore. Not after the way he'd reacted to Daniel's photograph. Not after the questions he'd asked. Samuel seemed to understand that. His expression grew serious. He folded his hands together on the table. For several moments he simply looked down. Gathering his thoughts. Choosing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I think I owe you an explanation." The room suddenly felt very quiet. Even the clock seemed softer. I sat down across from him. The old wooden chair creaked beneath my weight. Samuel looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man preparing to revisit a story he'd carried for years. I wasn't traveling through by accident. My stomach tightened. "I came here looking for someone." The words landed heavily. Looking. Not passing through. Not lost. Looking. Outside, sunlight glimmered across the snow. Inside, something cold moved through me. "Who?" I asked quietly. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached beside his chair and lifted a weathered leather satchel. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. It looked old. Used. The corners were worn smooth from years of travel. He placed it carefully on the table. Then opened it. Inside was a notebook. Thick. Faded. Held together by age and determination. Samuel rested his hand on the cover. Almost affectionately. Like someone touching an old friend. "I've been carrying this for nearly 12 years. The notebook looked ordinary. But something about the way he handled it made me uneasy. Samuel opened it slowly. Page after page revealed itself. Handwritten notes. Maps. Addresses. Photographs. Newspaper clippings. Names. Dozens of names. Maybe hundreds. Some crossed out. Some circled. Others connected by lines and dates. The notebook looked less like a journal and more like a roadmap through someone's life. Or perhaps many lives. I leaned closer. "What is all this?" Samuel's gaze remained fixed on the pages. "A search." The answer was simple. But it carried enormous weight. He carefully turned another page. Then another. The notebook seemed endless. Years of work compressed into paper. Years of questions. Years of roads. Small towns. Dead ends. Forgotten conversations. The evidence of a journey that refused to end. I've traveled across 6 states, Samuel said quietly. Following stories. My eyes remained on the notebook. What kind of stories? He hesitated. Then answered. Stories about a man who didn't know who he was. The room became still. Completely still. Even before he explained further, I felt something shift. Something important. Samuel turned another page. A photograph appeared. Black and white. Faded. A roadside diner. Several workers standing together. One face had been circled in pencil. The image was too small to identify clearly. But I could tell Samuel had studied it many times. He showed up in different places over the years, Samuel continued. Different names. Different jobs. I looked at him. Who? Samuel exhaled slowly. The man I was searching for. The answer only deepened the mystery. He continued turning pages. Town names. Employment records. Old newspaper advertisements. Handwritten notes in the margins. The story seemed scattered. Broken into fragments. As though someone had spent years assembling pieces of a puzzle without knowing the final image. Then Samuel stopped. His hand froze on a particular page. The air seemed to leave the room. Carefully. He turned the notebook toward me. My heart immediately began beating harder. Because staring back at me was something impossible. A newspaper clipping. Yellowed with age. Folded many times. Protected beneath clear plastic. The headline mentioned Daniel. My Daniel. My breath caught. I grabbed the edge of the table. The clipping described his disappearance. The date. The location. The search efforts. The names of investigators. Every detail matched. Almost every detail. Then I saw it. A sentence. One specific sentence. My hands began trembling. Because that information had never appeared publicly. Not once. Not in newspapers. Not on television. Not anywhere. Only law enforcement. Only family. Only a handful of people had known it. Yet here it was. Written neatly in Samuel's notebook. I looked up sharply. Where did you get this? Samuel met my eyes. For the first time since arriving. He didn't look away. I've been trying to answer that question myself. The room seemed smaller suddenly. The walls closer. The air heavier. I looked back down at the notebook. My fingers shook as I touched the edge of the page. How? Samuel sat silently for a moment. Then he spoke. Years seemed to gather behind his words. I met someone a long time ago. The house felt utterly silent now. Even the stove had stopped crackling. Samuel continued. It was about 15 years ago. His gaze drifted toward the window. Toward the bright snow beyond. He was working at a small repair shop outside Missouri. I listened carefully. Every nerve alert. He didn't carry identification. Samuel paused. He didn't talk much about his past. Another pause. And when people asked where he came from, Samuel lowered his eyes. He couldn't tell them. The words settled heavily between us. I barely breathed. Samuel's voice softened. He remembered pieces. Pieces? I asked. He nodded. A river. A farmhouse. A road. His expression darkened slightly. But not enough. The room seemed to tilt. Not physically. Emotionally. As though the foundation beneath everything I believed had shifted. What happened to him? I whispered. Samuel looked down at the notebook. At the years of notes filling its pages. At the evidence of a journey that had consumed much of his life. He spent years trying to remember. The answer came quietly. Years trying to figure out who he was. I stared at him. Unable to speak. Unable to look away. The sunlight outside suddenly felt too bright. The room too warm. The silence too loud. Because for the first time in 20 years, a possibility existed. Small. Fragile. Terrifying. A possibility I had never allowed myself to imagine. Not death. Not abandonment. Not betrayal. Something else. Something stranger. Samuel gently closed the notebook. The sound echoed softly through the kitchen. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then he looked directly at me. And asked the question neither of us could escape anymore. What if the man I met was Daniel? The room fell silent. And for the first time in 20 years, hope felt more frightening than grief. For a long time after Samuel asked the question, neither of us spoke. The kitchen seemed suspended between two worlds. One was the life I had known. The other was something entirely different. A possibility. A terrible, beautiful possibility. Outside. Sunlight shimmered across the snow-covered fields. The winter landscape looked unchanged. Yet nothing inside me felt unchanged anymore. I sat at the table staring at Samuel. At the notebook. At the years of searching scattered across its pages. Part of me wanted answers. Another part wanted the conversation to end before those answers arrived. Because once the truth enters a room, it never leaves. Samuel seemed to understand that. His eyes remained lowered. Patient. Careful. As though he knew every word from this point forward carried weight. Finally, he reached down beside his chair. There's something else. His voice was quiet. Almost reluctant. The words immediately tightened something inside my chest. Samuel bent slowly and lifted a small wooden box from his satchel. I hadn't seen it before. It was old. Dark oak. The corners were worn smooth from years of handling. A brass latch secured the front. Simple. Unremarkable. Yet the moment it touched the table, I felt myself stop breathing. Not because I recognized it. Because of the way Samuel handled it. With care. With respect. Almost reverence. As though what rested inside belonged to someone no longer present. For several moments he simply stared at it. Then he spoke. When the man died, these were among his belongings. The sentence hung heavily in the air. The man. Not Daniel. Not yet. Still only a possibility. Still only a mystery. Samuel rested his fingers on the lid. He didn't own much. The latch clicked softly. The sound echoed through the silent kitchen. Then the box opened. Inside were several ordinary objects. A pocket knife. A worn leather wallet. A folded handkerchief. A pair of reading glasses. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that could identify a missing husband from 20 years ago. At first glance, they looked like the belongings of any aging man. The quiet evidence of an ordinary life. Samuel carefully pushed the box toward me. You should see them. I hesitated. Then leaned forward. The objects carried the strange sadness found in abandoned things. Items that had once belonged to living hands. Now separated forever from their owner. My fingers hovered above the contents. Not touching. Just observing. The pocket knife showed years of use. The wallet looked nearly empty. The handkerchief had been mended more than once. Someone had valued these things. Someone had carried them for years. Then my eyes stopped. Completely. I felt my heartbeat stumble. A small object rested near the corner of the box, partially hidden beneath the folded cloth. Brass. Circular. No larger than my palm. The room seemed to shrink. My vision narrowed. The object became the only thing I could see. Slowly, I reached toward it. My fingers trembled before they even touched it. Because deep inside, some part of me already knew. I lifted it carefully. The brass felt cool against my skin, worn smooth from decades of use. The hinge squeaked faintly as I opened the cover. Inside rested a compass. Old. Beautiful. Familiar. My breath caught. The world disappeared. The kitchen. The snow. The ticking clock. Everything faded away. Because I had seen this compass before. Thousands of times. Years ago. On another winter morning. In another life. I closed my eyes. And suddenly I was 24 again. Standing inside a small jewelry shop downtown. Nervous. Excited. Holding a wrapped gift behind my back. Our first wedding anniversary. Daniel had always loved maps. Roads. Adventure. The idea of getting lost and finding his way again. So I bought him a compass. Not expensive. Not elaborate. Just meaningful. Something small. Something personal. Something that belonged only to us. When I opened my eyes, the compass remained in my hand. Real. Present. Impossible. A wave of emotion rose so quickly I couldn't speak. Samuel remained silent. Watching. Waiting. As though he had expected this moment. My thumb brushed the inside lid. Then I saw it. The inscription. Tiny. Nearly invisible. Hidden along the brass edge. Words so small most people would never notice them. But I knew exactly where to look. Because I had paid extra to have them engraved. My vision blurred instantly. I read the words. 3 simple words. Home is you. The phrase Daniel used to tell me whenever work took him away. Home is you. Not a house. Not a place. Not a town. Me. The compass slipped slightly in my shaking hands. Tears filled my eyes before I realized they were coming. I stared at the inscription. Again. 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 Hoping somehow it would change. Hoping reality would become less impossible. It didn't. The words remained. Permanent. Undeniable. Samuel finally spoke. You recognize it. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Unable to trust my voice. The compass felt heavier now. As though it carried every missing year inside its brass frame. Every unanswered question. Every lonely winter evening. Every candle placed in the window. The evidence sat in my hands. Physical. Real. Impossible to dismiss. No stranger could possess this object by accident. No coincidence could explain the inscription. No misunderstanding could account for it. The man Samuel had known. Had known Daniel. Or perhaps. My thoughts stopped there. I wasn't ready to finish that sentence. Not yet. The room fell silent. The kind of silence that follows certainty. Outside, the wind stirred loose snow across the fields. Inside, 20 years of doubt began quietly collapsing. I lowered the compass onto the table. Carefully. Reverently. As though it were fragile. Samuel watched me. His expression carried something close to sorrow. Not because he doubted the truth. Because he understood it. Understood what certainty costs. For years I had lived inside uncertainty. Uncertainty hurts. But certainty changes everything. I wiped my eyes. Slowly. Then looked toward the wooden box again. Only now did I notice something resting beneath the other belongings. A folded envelope. Yellowed with age. Protected inside a plastic sleeve. My heartbeat quickened immediately. Samuel followed my gaze. For a moment neither of us spoke. The envelope seemed to wait quietly between us. Ordinary. Yet somehow more powerful than everything else in the box. I looked at Samuel. What is that? His expression softened. Almost sadly. The answer came little more than a whisper. The last thing he left behind. The room grew still. My eyes returned to the envelope. Its edges were worn. Its surface creased from years of travel. One corner bore handwriting faded by time. I couldn't yet read the words. But I knew. Somehow I knew. The letter wasn't meant for Samuel. It wasn't meant for strangers. It wasn't meant for the world. It had been meant for someone waiting beside a window. Someone who kept a candle burning through 20 winters. Someone who never stopped believing entirely. My fingers hovered above the envelope. Afraid to touch it. Afraid not to. Because after all these years, one question remained. If Daniel was truly gone, what final message had he left behind? The envelope sat between us. Quiet. Motionless. Yet somehow it felt heavier than everything else in the room. Heavier than the wooden box. Heavier than the compass. Heavier than 20 years of unanswered questions. Outside. The afternoon sun had begun sinking lower across the snow-covered fields. Long shadows stretched across the pasture. The light inside the kitchen softened. Golden. Fragile. I couldn't stop staring at the envelope. Its edges were worn. Its paper yellowed by time. The corner had been folded once and carefully flattened again. Whoever had carried it had protected it for years. Samuel remained silent. He understood this moment didn't belong to him. The clock ticked softly above the stove. The fire settled lower. Neither sound seemed real anymore. My entire world had narrowed to a single piece of paper. A letter written by a man who had disappeared 20 years earlier. A man I had buried in my heart 100 different ways. Yet never truly let go. My fingers trembled as I reached toward it. Then stopped. I wasn't afraid of what I might find. I was afraid of what I might lose. For years, uncertainty had allowed possibility to survive. Once I opened the letter, possibility would become truth. And truth has a way of closing doors forever. Samuel gently pushed the envelope closer. You should read it. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I nodded. Slowly. Then lifted the envelope into my hands. The paper felt delicate. Almost fragile enough to crumble. I turned it over. There was no address. No stamp. Nothing to suggest it had ever been prepared for mailing. Only a name written across the front. My name. Margaret. The sight of it stole my breath. Not because of the name. Because of the handwriting. I knew those letters. The way the M curved slightly to the left. The way the final T never quite crossed fully. The slight slant. The uneven spacing. My heart immediately recognized it. Daniel. There was no doubt. Not even a little. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards. Shopping lists. Notes left beside the coffee pot. Love letters folded into lunchboxes. 20 years vanished in an instant. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I simply stared. Then I carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside crackled softly. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Like the opening of a door long sealed shut. I unfolded the pages. 3 sheets. Covered front and back. Daniel's handwriting filled every line. The room faded away. The snow. The fire. Samuel. Everything disappeared. Only the letter remained. I began to read. Margaret. If this letter reaches you, then someone finally succeeded where I failed. I don't know if you'll believe what I'm about to tell you. Some days I barely believe it myself. The words blurred immediately. I blinked away tears and continued. For many years, I couldn't remember who I was. Not my name. Not where I came from. Not where I belonged. Only fragments remained. I swallowed hard. The handwriting seemed alive somehow. As if Daniel were sitting across from me. Speaking softly. Patiently. Trying to explain the impossible. At first there was only darkness and confusion. Then small things started returning. Pieces of a life. Pieces of someone I used to be. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows. Inside, I continued reading. I would wake in the middle of the night with strange images in my mind. A dirt road disappearing into trees. A porch swing moving in summer wind. A field covered in snow. My chest tightened. Every image belonged to this place. Our place. Home. The memories never stayed long enough. They arrived like dreams. Gone before morning. I paused. My hands were shaking now. Samuel sat quietly across from me. Giving me space. Giving me silence. I returned to the letter. Then I began seeing a light. Always the same light. A candle burning in a window. A tear slipped down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I saw it again and again. Sometimes during sleep. Sometimes while awake. I never understood why. I only knew it felt important. The room blurred. The candle. My candle. The one I had placed in the window every evening for 20 years. Daniel had seen it. Not physically. Not truly. Yet somehow it had survived inside his damaged memory. A signal reaching across lost years. Across forgotten roads. Across an entire lifetime. I continued reading. There was also a woman. A face I could never fully see. Sometimes she stood beside the window. Sometimes beside a river. Sometimes laughing somewhere just beyond reach. I closed my eyes briefly. The pain wasn't sharp. It was something deeper. Sadder. The sadness of nearly remembering. Of almost finding your way home. I knew she mattered. More than anything. I just couldn't remember why. My hand covered my mouth. The kitchen had become completely silent. Even the clock seemed distant. Daniel's words continued. People told me to stop searching. They said memory wasn't worth chasing. That the past was gone. But every time I saw the candle or the woman, I knew they were wrong. The sunlight outside had begun fading. Evening approached quietly. The room filled with long shadows. I kept reading. So I traveled. Town after town. Job after job. Following pieces. Collecting clues. Trying to discover who I had once been. The next paragraph was shorter. Yet somehow harder to read. Every year brought a little more back. But never enough. Never fast enough. My vision blurred again. Because suddenly I understood. Daniel hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't chosen another life. He hadn't disappeared willingly. He had spent years searching for the same answers I had been searching for. Two people trapped inside the same mystery. Separated by distance neither understood. The final page trembled in my hands. Daniel's handwriting appeared less steady there. More fragile. As though written during illness. Or exhaustion. If you're reading this, then time finally ran out before my memory returned completely. For that, I am sorry. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. Gathering strength. Then continued. I don't know your face. Not clearly. I don't know your voice. Not anymore. But I know I loved you. I know that much survived. The tears came freely now. Quietly. Without resistance. And if you're still waiting somewhere, please stop waiting. You already gave me more time than I deserved. The final sentence sat alone at the bottom of the page. Simple. Painfully simple. Home was never the place I was trying to find. It was you. The letter slipped slightly in my hands. I stared at those final words. Unable to move. Unable to speak. The same truth engraved inside the compass. The same truth surviving across decades. Across memory loss. Across distance. Across an entire stolen lifetime. Eventually, I lowered the pages onto the table. The room remained silent. Only the fading sunlight moved. Samuel looked at me carefully. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I lifted my eyes. One question remained. Not about whether the man had been Daniel. The letter had answered that. No. A different question. One that hurt far more. If Daniel remembered enough to search. If he remembered the farmhouse. The candle. And the woman waiting beside the window. Then why had he never found his way home? The question remained in the room long after the letter was finished. Why had he never come home? The pages rested on the kitchen table between Samuel and me. Daniel's handwriting still seemed alive somehow. As though if I looked away for too long, the ink might continue writing by itself. Outside, evening had settled across the fields. The snow reflected the last traces of daylight. Everything beyond the window appeared distant. Muted. The world felt suspended. Caught somewhere between grief and understanding. I folded the letter carefully. Not because I was finished reading it. I knew I would read it 100 more times. 1,000. But because I needed a moment to breathe. My hands rested quietly in my lap. The compass sat beside the folded pages. The inscription glimmered softly beneath the fading light. Home is you. 20 years. 20 years of waiting. 20 years of questions. And somehow those 3 words carried more truth than everything else. Samuel remained. Silent. Patient. Allowing the weight of the letter to settle. Eventually I looked up. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. He remembered. Samuel nodded. Some of it. The answer landed heavily. Some of it. Not enough. Never enough. I stared toward the darkening window. Toward the road Daniel had once traveled. Toward the road he never returned from. If he remembered. My throat tightened. Why didn't he come back? The question sounded different now. Not angry. Not accusing. Simply wounded. Samuel lowered his eyes. For a long moment he didn't answer. The silence told me the truth would hurt. Then he spoke. Because he wasn't sure. The words confused me. Sure of what? Samuel exhaled slowly. That the memories were real. The room grew still again. I listened. Carefully. He spent years chasing fragments. Samuel's voice softened. A farmhouse in one dream. A woman's laugh in another. A road he thought he recognized. He paused. Most of the time, the trail went nowhere. I imagined Daniel traveling from town to town, following pieces of himself. Pieces too small to trust. Too fragile to build a life upon. Samuel continued. There were dozens of false leads. His gaze drifted toward the notebook. Maybe hundreds. The old notebook sat quietly on the table. Years of searching trapped inside its pages. He'd remember a name. Samuel said. Then discover it belonged to someone else. He'd recognize a street. Then learn he'd never been there. Each sentence felt like another mile added to Daniel's journey. Another year. Another disappointment. Another door closing. I lowered my eyes. The sadness felt different now. Before, I had imagined abandonment. Then tragedy. Now I saw something worse. Hope repeatedly breaking apart. Samuel rubbed his hands together slowly, as though warming old memories. There were times he thought he was close. His voice became distant. Almost reflective. Close enough to taste it. I listened carefully. He'd pack his things. Travel hundreds of miles. Follow some tiny clue. Samuel shook his head. And it would lead nowhere. The kitchen remained silent. The clock ticked softly overhead. Outside, darkness continued gathering across the snow. I could almost see Daniel moving through those years. A man chasing shadows. Searching for a life he couldn't fully remember. Searching for me. Yet never certain enough to stop. Why didn't he write sooner? I whispered. Samuel looked at the letter. Then at me. Because he was afraid. The answer surprised me. Afraid? He nodded. The sadness in his eyes deepened. He told me once that remembering pieces felt worse than remembering nothing. I frowned slightly. Samuel continued. Imagine knowing someone important is waiting. His voice barely rose above a whisper. But not knowing who they are. The truth of it settled slowly. Painfully. He worried he might be wrong. Samuel said. He worried he'd contact people and discover they weren't his family. He worried he'd reopen old wounds. The words struck harder than I expected. Because I could hear Daniel in them. The Daniel I had known. Careful. Thoughtful. Always worrying about other people before himself. Always carrying responsibility he didn't deserve. Samuel stared into the fading light. He was ashamed. The word lingered. Heavy. Unexpected. Why? Samuel's answer came quietly. Because every year that passed made it harder. I understood immediately. Without explanation. The longer Daniel remained gone, the more impossible returning must have seemed. How do you explain 10 missing years? 15? 20? How do you walk back into a life after disappearing from it? The burden must have grown heavier with each passing season. Samuel nodded slightly, as though reading my thoughts. He convinced himself people had moved on. The sentence broke something inside me. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just quietly. The way ice cracks beneath deep snow. Because I knew exactly what Daniel had never understood. I hadn't moved on. Not really. Not completely. The candle still burned in the window. Every night. Every winter. Every year. Samuel's voice softened. Further. Then his health started failing. I looked up sharply. The room seemed colder. When? About 5 years before he died. The words settled heavily. Samuel leaned back in his chair. He began forgetting things again. A knot formed in my chest. Not memory loss. Not after everything else. Not after all those years spent trying to remember. The cruelty of it felt unbearable. He fought it. Samuel said. Hard. I could hear admiration in his voice. Respect. He kept notes. He kept journals. He wrote everything down. The notebook suddenly carried new meaning. Not merely a search. A defense. A battle against disappearing. Samuel glanced toward it. Every memory mattered. Every memory. Every clue. Every fragment. Because he knew they might vanish again. The room remained silent for several moments. Then Samuel reached into his satchel. He removed a folded piece of paper. A photograph. Carefully he slid it across the table. I picked it up. The image was recent. Much more recent than anything I'd seen before. An older man stood outside a repair shop. Gray hair. Weathered face. Tired eyes. But the smile. The smile was Daniel's. My breath caught instantly. There he was. Not as I remembered him. Not frozen in youth. Real. Aged. Human. A life continuing beyond the day he vanished. Tears blurred my vision. Again. Samuel waited quietly. Giving me time. Finally he spoke. The last few months. His voice grew softer. He started remembering more than ever before. I stared at the photograph. Daniel's face. Daniel's eyes. Daniel's smile. The pieces finally fit together. Samuel continued. He knew there had been a farmhouse. He knew there had been a wife. He knew someone was waiting. A tear slipped onto the photograph. I wiped it away immediately. But the question remained. If he finally knew, why didn't he come? Samuel looked toward the folded letter. Then back at me. His answer arrived gently. He was dying. The room fell silent. Utterly silent. Outside, darkness swallowed the last light beyond the fields. Inside, the truth settled over everything. Heavy. Final. Daniel had finally found himself. Finally found the road home. Finally understood who he was. And time had run out. Too late to travel. Too late to return. Too late to stand on the porch himself. Samuel's eyes lowered. The last promise he asked of me. His voice nearly broke. Was to finish the journey he couldn't. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time understanding why he had crossed 6 states. Why he had carried the notebook. The box. The letter. The compass. Why he had arrived at my door during a snowstorm. He wasn't searching anymore. He was delivering someone home. The room remained quiet. Only the fire whispered inside the stove. And as I sat there holding the photograph of the man I had waited 20 years to see again, another question slowly emerged. Not whether Daniel had loved me. Not whether he had tried. The letter had answered those things. No. The question now was far more difficult. After everything that had been stolen. After 20 years of absence. After all the winters spent waiting beside that window. Could I ever forgive the years we had lost forever? That evening, after Samuel had gone upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen. The house was quiet again. Not the old kind of quiet. Not the familiar loneliness that had lived here for 20 years. This was something different. A silence filled with ghosts. Not frightening ghosts. Memories. Questions. Pieces of a life finally beginning to make sense. Outside. Night settled gently over the fields. The snow reflected pale moonlight across the pasture. The world beyond the windows looked soft. Still. Almost dreamlike. I lit the candle and placed it in its usual spot. The same window. The same flame. The same ritual. For a long moment I simply stood there watching it burn. The golden light trembled against the glass. 20 years. 20 winters. 20 years of believing the candle meant one thing. Now I wasn't so sure. I returned to the table carrying Daniel's letter. The paper had already begun softening at the folds from how many times I had opened it that day. 3 times. Perhaps 4. I had lost count. Each reading revealed something different. A word I had overlooked. A sentence I had rushed past. A feeling hidden between the lines. I unfolded the pages again. Slowly. Carefully. As though opening something sacred. The handwriting felt familiar now. Comfortingly familiar. For years I had feared forgetting the shape of his words. The rhythm of his thoughts. Yet here they were. Waiting patiently on paper. I read the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Again. The fire crackled softly inside the stove. The clock ticked above the sink. The house breathed around me. And all the while Daniel's voice seemed to emerge from the pages. Not literally. Not as a ghost. Just memory. Powerful memory. The kind that survives longer than reason. I stopped at a particular sentence. The one about the candle. The image that had returned to him again and again. A light in a window. A signal he could never fully understand. My eyes drifted toward the flame. Still burning. Still waiting. For years I had imagined Daniel gone forever. Dead. Lost somewhere beyond explanation. Or perhaps worse. I had imagined him choosing another life. Choosing another family. Choosing to leave me behind. I hated myself for those thoughts. Yet grief creates strange stories when answers never come. Some nights I convinced myself he was dead. Other nights I convinced myself he was alive and simply unwilling to return. Neither possibility brought peace. Both left scars. I folded the letter briefly and stared into the fire. The flames shifted and collapsed inward. Orange light flickered across the room. For the first time, I understood something painful. I had spent years grieving the wrong man. Not Daniel. The version of Daniel I had invented. The version who abandoned me. The version who disappeared willingly. The version who stopped loving me. That man had never existed. The real Daniel had been suffering too. Searching. Trying. Failing. Trying again. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because it changed the past. Because it changed everything I thought I knew about it. A tear slipped down my cheek. I brushed it away. Then another followed. And another. Quiet tears. The kind that arrive without warning. Without drama. The kind grief saves for private moments. I lowered my eyes to the letter once more. The words. Blurred. Not from age. From tears. For years I had imagined tragedy as a single event. A car accident. A fall. A sudden loss. Something immediate. Something final. But this tragedy had unfolded differently. One day at a time. One forgotten memory at a time. One missed opportunity at a time. A man trying desperately to remember. A woman waiting desperately for answers. Neither knowing the other was still fighting. The cruelty of it seemed impossible. The clock struck 9. The sound echoed softly through the house. I remembered another evening long ago. Daniel sitting across from me at this same table. His boots muddy from work. His sleeves rolled up. Talking about repairing the north fence before winter arrived. An ordinary conversation. An ordinary night. At the time it felt insignificant. Now I would have traded anything to sit inside that moment again. Not because it was extraordinary. Because it wasn't. Most people don't realize it while they're living them. But ordinary moments become priceless once they're gone. I smiled faintly through my tears. Daniel had always hated replacing fences. Always complained about it. Yet somehow that memory felt precious now. The house seemed full of him suddenly. His coat still hanging in the hallway. His photograph above the mantel. His handwriting resting on the table before me. For years those objects had felt like relics. Evidence of someone lost. Now they felt different. Not relics. Proof. Proof that he had existed. Proof that he had loved me. Proof that he had spent 20 years trying to find his way back. The candle flickered as a draft moved through the room. Its reflection danced softly across the window. I found myself wondering how many nights Daniel had seen that image in his dreams. How many times he had awakened with the feeling that someone was waiting. How many times he had stood on the edge of remembering. Only to lose the memory again. The thought broke my heart. Not because he failed. Because he came so close. So many times. Close enough to see home. Close enough to feel it. Yet never close enough to reach it. The fire burned lower. The shadows deepened around the room. I folded the letter once more and held it gently in my hands. The paper felt warm now. Almost alive. Outside, snow drifted softly beneath the moonlight. The same fields. The same road. The same farmhouse. Everything looked unchanged. Yet nothing was. Because the waiting had ended. Not the way I imagined. Not with a reunion. Not with footsteps on the porch. Not with Daniel walking through the front door. But it had ended. The mystery was gone. The truth had arrived. And somehow the truth hurt more than uncertainty ever had. For 20 years I had mourned a disappearance. Now I had to mourn a life. A real life. A life filled with struggle. Mistakes. Hope. Fear. And endless searching. I looked toward the candle one final time. Its flame had grown smaller. Steadier. Quieter. Like the ending of a long conversation. And sitting there in the fading light, holding the final letter from the man I had never stopped loving, I found myself facing a question no one had prepared me for. How does a person mourn someone they have been waiting for all along? Because losing Daniel once had nearly destroyed me. But losing him again, after finally finding him, felt like learning grief all over from the beginning. The next morning arrived quietly. The storm had finally moved on. Sunlight spilled across the fields in long bands of gold, turning the snow into something almost beautiful. For the first time in days, the road beyond the farmhouse was visible again. The drifts had settled. The wind had calmed. Everything seemed to suggest the journey was over. At least Samuel's journey. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee warming my hands. Outside, a truck passed slowly along the distant road. Life moving forward. The world continuing as it always had. Yet inside the farmhouse, time felt strangely suspended. Neither Samuel nor I spoke much during breakfast. There wasn't much left to say. The notebook had been opened. The compass had been identified. The letter had been read. The mystery that had defined 2 decades of my life had finally been answered. And yet I felt no sense of completion. Only quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a storm after it has taken everything it came for. Samuel folded his napkin and placed it carefully beside his plate. Then he looked toward the window. The roads look clear. I nodded. They do. His gaze lingered outside for a moment. Neither of us mentioned what the statement truly meant. He would be leaving. The reason he had come here no longer existed. The promise had been fulfilled. The search had ended. For several moments we sat in silence. Then Samuel offered a small smile. The same tired smile I had seen when he first stepped through the door. I suppose this is where I say goodbye. The words landed softly. Yet they carried surprising weight. Because in only a few days, this stranger had become connected to the most important story of my life. Without him, Daniel would still be lost. Without him, I would still be waiting. I set down my coffee. I'm glad you came. Samuel lowered his eyes. So am I. The simplicity of his answer made my throat tighten. Outside, sunlight reflected off the snow. Inside, the old farmhouse seemed to listen. Samuel stood and retrieved his satchel from beside the door. The familiar worn leather looked lighter now. As though carrying less burden. He slipped the notebook inside. Then paused. Something in his expression changed. A hesitation. A thought unfinished. Slowly. He looked back toward me. There's one more thing. The words immediately caught my attention. Samuel opened the satchel again. For a moment he searched inside. Then withdrew a small object wrapped in brown cloth. Carefully. Almost reverently. I felt my pulse quicken. Another item. Another piece of Daniel. Samuel crossed the room and placed it gently on the table. The cloth unfolded. Inside rested a journal. Smaller than the notebook. Older. Its dark leather cover showed years of wear. The corners were rounded. The spine creased. A life compressed into paper. Samuel rested his hand on it briefly. He kept this during the last years. My eyes remained fixed on the journal. The room suddenly felt smaller. Closer. As though everything important now existed within arm's reach. He wanted you to have it. I looked up. You never mentioned it. Samuel nodded slowly. I wasn't sure when the right time would be. The honesty in his voice left no room for argument. I reached toward the journal. My fingers touched the leather. Warm from where Samuel's hand had rested. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. The letter had already changed everything. What more could remain? Yet some instinct told me this was different. The letter explained the facts. The journal contained the man. Finally, I opened the cover. The first page revealed Daniel's handwriting. Older now. Less steady than before. Yet unmistakably his. The sight of it immediately tightened something inside my chest. I turned another page. Then another. Dates filled the margins. Observations. Thoughts. Fragments of memory. Questions. The record of a man fighting not to disappear. The kitchen faded around me as I began reading. Saw the candle again last night. Same window. Same light. I don't know where it is. But I know it's waiting. I stared at the words. Then turned the page. Dreamed of snow. A farmhouse beyond a field. A woman standing near a window. Could not see her face. Woke up feeling lonely. My breath caught. The words felt intimate. Raw. Unprotected. These weren't explanations written for another person. They were private thoughts. Moments Daniel never expected anyone else to read. I continued. Page after page. Year after year. The same image returned. The candle. Always the candle. The light appeared again. Why does it feel familiar? Another page. I think someone is waiting for me. I wish I knew who. Another. The candle looked brighter tonight. Maybe because I remembered more. My vision blurred. I closed the journal briefly. Not because I wanted to stop reading. Because I suddenly understood something extraordinary. For 20 years, I had believed the ritual belonged only to me. A lonely woman lighting a candle in an empty farmhouse. A symbol of hope. A symbol of waiting. Yet somehow that small act had survived inside Daniel's memory. Not consciously. Not completely. But enough. Enough to follow him through lost decades. Enough to appear in dreams. Enough to remain when names and faces vanished. The realization overwhelmed me. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, sunlight shimmered across untouched snow. The same landscape Daniel had carried inside his mind. The same landscape he spent years trying to find. Behind me. The journal remained open on the table. Its pages filled with evidence of a strange connection neither of us understood. I placed a hand against the glass. Cold. Solid. Real. And suddenly I saw it clearly. Two people separated by impossible distance. One lighting a candle. One dreaming about it. Both holding on to the same fragile thread. Both refusing to let go. Not because they understood why. Because hope sometimes survives without explanation. I felt tears gathering again. Not painful tears this time. Something softer. Something closer to gratitude. Samuel stepped quietly beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence felt comfortable. Peaceful. Eventually he looked toward the window. Maybe that's what kept him searching. I nodded. Maybe. Or maybe love leaves marks deeper than memory. Deeper than time. Deeper than understanding. The journal rested on the table behind us. The final gift from a man who never stopped trying to come home. Yet as I stared across the fields, another question slowly emerged. A question larger than grief. Larger than loss. For 20 years, my life had been defined by waiting. Every evening. Every candle. Every winter. Waiting had become part of who I was. But now the truth had arrived. The search was over. The mystery was gone. Daniel had been found. Not alive. Not returning. But found. And standing there beside the window where so many years had passed, I realized I no longer knew what came next. Because if waiting had shaped my entire life, what should I do now that the waiting was finally over? Spring arrived quietly. Not all at once. Not with sudden warmth or bright green fields. It came the way most important things do. Slowly. Patiently. Almost unnoticed at first. The snow melted from the southern side of the pasture before anywhere else. Small patches of brown earth began appearing beside the road. The creek behind the farmhouse woke from winter. Its water moved again. Softly. Steadily. As though time itself had started flowing once more. For years, I had measured life differently. Not by seasons. Not by holidays. Not even by birthdays. I measured it by waiting. One winter after another. One candle after another. One unanswered year after another. But now something had changed. The waiting was over. The truth had arrived. And strangely, life kept moving. The sun still rose. The birds still returned. The fields still greened beneath spring rain. For a while, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. The question followed me everywhere. What comes after waiting? Every morning I woke expecting grief to feel different. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Some days I felt lighter. Other days I found myself standing in the hallway staring at Daniel's coat for reasons I couldn't explain. Healing, I discovered, wasn't a straight road. It wandered. Just like memory. Just like love. One afternoon, I climbed onto a ladder and repaired a loose shutter that had rattled against the house for years. Daniel always meant to fix it. Then I always meant to fix it. Neither of us ever had. Now, standing beneath a clear spring sky, I finally tightened the loose hinge. The shutter stopped rattling. The silence that followed felt strangely satisfying. Not because the repair mattered. Because it represented something else. Movement. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't preserving the farmhouse. I was living in it. The difference was small. But important. Weeks passed. Then more. The fields brightened. Wildflowers appeared along the fence line. The apple tree beside the barn blossomed earlier than usual. The farmhouse slowly changed too. A fresh coat of paint on the porch railing. A repaired gate. A new screen in the kitchen window. Small things. Ordinary things. The sort of tasks people do when they expect to remain somewhere. One evening, while sweeping the front porch, I caught myself humming. The realization stopped me. Not because the tune mattered. Because I couldn't remember the last time I had done it. For years grief had occupied every corner of the house. Now it seemed to be making room. Not leaving. Just shifting. Finding a quieter place to sit. Daniel's journal remained on the table inside. I still read it often. Sometimes before breakfast. Sometimes before bed. The pages had become familiar companions. Through them, I learned pieces of the life he had lived after disappearing. The towns he visited. The jobs he worked. The memories he chased. The hopes he carried. And always, returning like a distant lighthouse, the candle. The light in the window. The image he could never fully explain. One particular entry stayed with me. I had read it dozens of times. Yet it never lost its power. Maybe the light isn't guiding me home. Maybe it's reminding me that home still exists. Simple words. Yet somehow they contained an entire lifetime. One evening near the end of spring, I found myself standing before the familiar window. The sun had already set. Darkness settled gently across the fields. The same window. The same view. The same place where 20 years had passed. On the table beside me rested a candle. New. And used. Waiting. For a long moment I simply stared at it. My hand resting lightly on its smooth surface. The ritual had always felt automatic before. Something I did because I couldn't imagine stopping. Something I did because hope demanded it. But now the meaning had changed. The person I had been waiting for was no longer lost. The road had finally ended. The mystery had finally been solved. The search had finally come home. I picked up the candle. The room remained quiet. The old farmhouse creaked softly around me. Not lonely. Not anymore. Just alive. I placed the candle on the windowsill. Exactly where it had always stood. Then I struck a match. The flame appeared instantly. Small. Golden. Steady. I watched it catch. Watched the light bloom against the glass. Outside, darkness stretched across the fields. Inside, the reflection of the flame shimmered softly in the windowpane. For years I had lit the candle as a signal. A message. A promise. A declaration that someone was still waiting. Tonight felt different. Tonight I wasn't calling someone home. Tonight I was honoring the fact that he had finally arrived. Not physically. Not the way I once dreamed. But in truth. In understanding. In peace. The realization settled gently inside me. Hope and goodbye were not opposites. For years I believed they were. I thought choosing one meant abandoning the other. But standing there before the candle, I finally understood. Hope had carried me through the waiting. Goodbye allowed me to carry the love forward. Both belonged together. Both always had. A tear slipped down my cheek. I smiled through it. Not because I was happy. Not because I was sad. Because for the first time in 20 years, I felt complete. The missing pieces had found their place. The story had finally reached its ending. Or perhaps its beginning. Outside, the stars slowly emerged above the fields. One by one. Silent and patient. The candle continued burning beside the window. Its reflection glowing softly against the darkness. Hours passed. I never moved it. Never extinguished it. I simply sat nearby with Daniel's journal resting in my lap. Listening to the sounds of the farmhouse. Listening to the sounds of life continuing. Sometime near dawn, I looked up. The eastern horizon had begun turning pale. Soft blue. Then silver. Morning arriving. The candle still burned. Steady. Unwavering. Its light no longer seemed lonely. It seemed fulfilled. Like a journey completed. Like a promise kept. Like a road finally reaching home. I walked to the window one last time and watched the first sunlight touch the fields. The same fields Daniel had remembered. The same fields I had watched through every season of waiting. Now they belonged to neither grief nor hope. Only truth. And sometimes, I realized, truth arrives long after the waiting ends. Not to erase the years that were lost. Not to undo the pain. But to remind us that love can survive things memory cannot. The candle flickered gently against the glass. And as dawn filled the farmhouse with light, I finally whispered the words I had carried for 20 years. Welcome home, Daniel. Then I smiled. And for the first time, I let the morning in.